The image of the knight, mounted on his steed, sword gleaming under the sun and banner unfurled in the wind, has always been wrapped in an aura of glory, honor, and courage. Yet behind this romantic symbol perpetuated by legend lies a far darker truth. The most feared knights in history were not born from ideals of pure chivalry, but from a reality forged in blood, fear, and violence. They were not merely warriors in service to kings and feudal lords. They were instruments of power, molded on battlefields where terror was as valuable as victory. The origins of these knightly orders are tied directly to an age of instability and endless war. Medieval Europe was a fragmented continent, marked by invasions, territorial disputes, and religious conflict. In this chaos emerged armed groups who not only protected lands and treasures, but also presented themselves as defenders of faith. It was the perfect fusion of religion and war, a dangerous marriage that allowed these warriors to act with near-divine authority. The earliest accounts of these orders showed that their rise was swift and brutal. They stood out not only for their skill in combat, but also for how they cultivated fear as a strategic weapon. On the battlefield, they wielded not just the strength of their blades, but also the reputation that preceded them. Enemies, hearing of their approach, often felt defeated before even raising a sword. This aura of invincibility was not earned solely through discipline, but through acts of cruelty that transformed knights into living legends of terror. One of the secrets to their rise lay in the ritualization of violence. For these warriors, war was not merely a necessity. It was a sacred rite. They believed that spilling blood was a form of purification, and this mindset turned the battlefield into a stage for sacrifice. Each victory was celebrated not just as military conquest, but as spiritual triumph. This fusion of faith and violence gave knights an air of invulnerability, as if they were emissaries of a justice beyond human comprehension. But the truth was far darker. To consolidate their fame, they did not hesitate to massacre entire villages, burn territories, and impose their law by the sword. Fear spread faster than any army, and that was their greatest weapon. Feudal lords and kings quickly realized the usefulness of these warriors. They were not just soldiers, were symbols of power, capable of subduing enemies not only through force but through terror. Another crucial element of their fearsome reputation was iron discipline. The life of a knight was not one of constant luxury, but of brutal training and blind obedience to their order. Total submission transformed these men into true machines of war, molded to follow commands without question. This fanatic devotion to discipline made them deadlier than entire armies of ordinary soldiers. Over time, knightly orders amassed not only military might, but also political and economic power. They received donations of land, gold, and privileges from nobility and clergy, establishing themselves as institutions that transcended mere warfare. Their wealth grew alongside their power, and in many regions, they became more influential than kings and lords. The aura of religious devotion masked an empire of violence and wealth, sustained by the sword and the blood spilled in the name of faith. This bloody origin is the deepest secret the chivalric myth seeks to hide. Behind the tales of bravery and protection of the weak lay a system built on massacres, violent rituals, and fanatical faith that legitimized even the cruelest acts. The most feared knights in history were born from this fusion of devotion and violence, and their fame was constructed not through justice, but through the fear they inspired. Thus, what was sold as honor was, in truth, a dark pact between power, religion, and blood. And this was only the seed of a legacy that, over time, would become even more disturbing. Revealing that the glory of knights stood much closer to darkness than to light, the fearsome reputation of the most dreaded knightly orders was not forged solely on battlefields soaked in blood. It was also born in secret chambers, torchlit halls, and ritualistic practices that blurred the line between faith and fanaticism. Behind the polished armor and gleaming swords were ceremonies whispered about in hushed tones, rites of passage so disturbing that they transformed ordinary men into instruments of terror. These initiation rituals were not only about testing loyalty, they were about stripping away humanity and binding recruits to a brotherhood whose laws were darker than any written by kings. The secrecy surrounding these initiations was deliberate. Outsiders were forbidden to know the details, and even within the order, silence was demanded. Chroniclers recorded fragments of these ceremonies, though most accounts are veiled in rumor, suspicion, or accusations spread by rivals. Yet the very existence of such secrecy fueled fear. The people believed, and often rightly so, that the rites of these knights involved oaths so absolute, so drenched in symbolism and blood, that breaking them was worse than death. Candidates entering the order were not greeted with honor and praise. Instead, they were broken down. Ritual humiliation stripped them of their former identity. They were told that once they stepped into the shadows of the order, they ceased to exist as individuals. Their family ties, personal ambitions, even their own names were eclipsed by the brotherhood. To belong, they had to shed the last remnants of ordinary life, becoming vessels of obedience. Some accounts describe initiations that began with days of fasting, isolation, and prayer, not as acts of devotion, but as tools of disorientation. Weakened in body and mind, the recruit was then led into a hall lit only by fire, surrounded by armored knights who watched in silence. In that suffocating atmosphere, the candidate swore oaths of loyalty not just to the order, but to its darkest codes, promises of silence, absolute obedience, and unwavering devotion, no matter the cruelty demanded. There are stories, whispered through history, of blood being drawn during these rituals. Some sources claim that recruits were cut with blades, forced to shed blood as a sign of sacrifice. Others suggest that drinking from ceremonial chalices was required, a symbolic act of binding oneself to the lifeblood of the order. Whether myth or truth, these rumors persisted because they reflected the fear these knights inspired. People wanted to believe that no ordinary soldier could endure such initiation. Only rituals steeped in horror could explain their unbreakable unity. Equally chilling were the psychological elements of these rites. Candidates were forced to confront death itself, sometimes made to dig their own graves, sometimes ordered to lie in coffins, symbolically burying their old lives. These acts were not mere theatrics. They imprinted on the recruit a terrifying truth. The order was their only life now, and the brotherhood would be their only grave. Death no longer belonged to them as individuals, but was claimed by the institution they served. And then there were the oaths of silence. Breaking the secrecy of the order was punishable by death, not only for the offender, but sometimes for those around him. These promises were enforced with fear and ritual curses. A knight who betrayed the order was believed to be cursed in this life and the next. This spiritual terror was as binding as any physical chain, ensuring loyalty through dread of consequences both earthly and eternal. But perhaps the darkest part of initiation was the transformation of morality itself. Recruits were taught that their actions, no matter how cruel, were sanctified if commanded by the order. Mercy was weakness, hesitation was betrayal. To obey was to be pure, to question was to be damned. Through this indoctrination, men who once held human doubts or compassion were recast as zealots, convinced that the most brutal deeds were justified if performed under the banner of their brotherhood. These rituals served a deeper purpose than loyalty, created terror not just in enemies, but in the knights themselves. Once bound by such oaths, recruits could not escape. They were trapped, knowing that betrayal or desertion meant death. The order's grip was psychological as much as physical, a network of fear that chained men tighter than any iron shackle. The rumors of these initiations spread far beyond the walls of the orders. Villagers, clergy, and nobles alike spoke of the terrifying ceremonies, embellishing them with every retelling. Whispers of satanic rites, forbidden sacrifices, and unholy pacts circulated. While many of these accusations may have been exaggerations, they added to the aura of dread that surrounded the knights. Enemies on the battlefield did not see mere warriors. They saw men who had undergone transformations in dark chambers, molded by rituals too terrifying to imagine. The symbolism of the initiation rituals also had profound political power. By cloaking themselves in secrecy, these knightly orders elevated their image from soldiers to something more mythic, a brotherhood chosen, set apart, and untouchable. The aura of mystery allowed them to move through kingdoms not only as warriors but as figures of fear and reverence. When knights swore that their loyalty was eternal, it was not just rhetoric. It was backed by rituals that demanded the annihilation of the self and the embrace of something greater, darker, and more absolute. Looking back, it becomes clear that these ceremonies were less about faith than about control. They stripped recruits of autonomy, reshaped their identities, and fused them into an unstoppable machine of obedience. What began as religious devotion became psychological domination. By manipulating fear, ritual, and secrecy, the knightly orders ensured that their warriors were not just skilled fighters, but zealots prepared to kill, torture, and die without question. The legacy of these dark initiations lingers even now. The myths of secret chambers, blood oaths, and forbidden rites have etched themselves into cultural memory. Whether fully true or exaggerated by rumor, the fact remains. The most feared knights in history wielded terror not just with their swords, but with the rituals that bound them together. Their greatest weapon was not their steel, but their transformation into instruments of fanatical will. And so, behind every tale of knightly glory, behind every shining lance or fluttering banner, there is a shadow. The echo of rituals whispered in torchlight, oaths carved in blood, and the chilling knowledge that the path to becoming one of the most feared knights in history was paved not with honor, but with terror. Faith, in its purest form, can inspire hope, unity, and purpose. But when it is fused with violence, wielded like a blade, and twisted into dogma, faith becomes something far more terrifying: fanaticism. For the most feared knights in history, this was their true secret weapon. It was not their steel, nor their numbers, but their unshakable conviction that they were chosen by divine will, their actions sanctified by heaven itself. When faith became a weapon, it forged an army of zealots who believed their cause justified any cruelty, no matter how horrific. The transformation from devotion to fanaticism was gradual but deliberate. In the medieval world, religion was not simply a private belief, but the backbone of law, culture, and politics. Knights swore oaths not just to lords or kings, but to God, binding their violence with a veneer of righteousness. Every campaign became a crusade, every battle a holy war. To question their brutality was not to challenge soldiers, but to challenge the will of God, and that made them untouchable. What began as vows of service quickly evolved into doctrines of conquest. Preachers and clerics aligned with knightly orders told them that to kill in the name of faith was not only permitted but sacred. Their swords did not simply cut flesh. They executed divine judgment. To hesitate in battle was to sin. To show mercy was to betray heaven itself. Through sermons, chants, and blessings before combat, knights were transformed into instruments of holy terror, convinced that every drop of blood they spilled brought them closer to eternal reward. This fanaticism blurred the line between piety and cruelty. Villages that resisted were not seen as homes of ordinary people, but as dens of heretics and infidels. Entire communities were burned to the ground, their destruction justified as purification. Enemies were not simply adversaries in war, but enemies of God, stripped of humanity and treated as obstacles to be annihilated. Fanaticism allowed knights to perform atrocities with clear consciences, believing that every act of cruelty was another step toward salvation. One of the most chilling aspects of this weaponized faith was how it manipulated fear. Those who opposed the knights were told that resistance was not only futile, but sacrilegious. Surrender became the only way to preserve not just life but the soul. Many victims submitted without a fight, convinced that standing against these holy warriors meant damnation in this world and the next. In this way, faith did more than inspire the knights. It paralyzed their enemies, crushing hope before swords were even drawn. The rituals of the knightly orders reinforced this fanaticism. Before campaigns, they gathered in chapels lit by candlelight, where priests blessed their weapons, sprinkling steel with holy water and declaring it the arm of God. Hymns echoed through stone walls, filling men with the belief that they were no longer mortals but divine instruments. On the battlefield, banners bearing sacred symbols were raised high, reminding both knights and enemies alike that these warriors did not fight under kings but under heaven's command. Every charge, every slash, every burning village became a sermon written in blood. This weaponization of faith extended beyond the battlefield. In politics, knightly orders claimed authority not through negotiation but through divine mandate. Their demands were framed as God's will, making refusal equivalent to heresy. Kings and nobles, even when skeptical, often bowed to their power, unwilling to risk accusations of blasphemy. In this way, fanaticism not only fueled violence, but also secured dominance over rulers who feared the wrath of both heaven and the armed brotherhoods that claimed to represent it. Yet the most terrifying truth was that many knights genuinely believed in their cause. They were not mercenaries fighting for coin, but zealots convinced of their righteousness. This sincerity made them far more dangerous. A soldier driven by greed can be bought. A soldier driven by fear can be broken. But a soldier convinced that God commands his hand cannot be swayed. He will fight until his last breath, and his cruelty will be endless, for he sees it not as cruelty, but as service. The cost of this fanaticism was immense. Blood flowed not just in wars, but in massacres that left entire regions depopulated. Sacred sites were desecrated, towns reduced to ashes, and terror spread across continents. What was claimed as a divine mission left scars that outlasted the orders themselves. Etched into the memory of peoples who learned to associate knights not with honor, but with horror. The sword and the cross, fused together, became inseparable symbols of both salvation and suffering. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is how this fanaticism corrupted the very idea of faith. Religion, which could have been a source of compassion and unity, was weaponized into justification for domination and cruelty. The knights turned prayers into war cries, blessings into curses, and the hope of eternal life into a tool of manipulation. Their fanaticism not only destroyed their enemies, but also hollowed out the meaning of the beliefs they claimed to defend. Even centuries later, the stories linger. Chroniclers recorded tales of knights who stormed into villages with chants on their lips, burning homes while singing hymns. Survivors describe the terror of seeing banners of the cross accompanied not by mercy, but by slaughter. Too many of these knights embodied the nightmare of religion transformed into tyranny. Their legacy remains a warning of how easily devotion can become fanaticism, and how easily faith can be twisted into the most dangerous weapon of all. In the end, the image that survives is not of shining heroes on horseback, but of figures cloaked in steel, their faces hidden, their eyes burning with conviction. They march not as men but as zealots, believing their cruelty carries the weight of heaven. And as they raise their swords high, they do so not for kings, not for glory, but for a faith that has become indistinguishable from fanaticism. The story of these knights is not one of honor, but of warning. It reveals how quickly the sacred can become profane, when wielded as a tool of power, and how the most feared warriors in history were not only skilled with weapons, but armed with a belief so absolute that it left no room for mercy. When faith became a weapon, it forged monsters disguised as saints, and their shadow still lingers across the annals of history. When we imagine knights, we think of shining armor, chivalric vows, and the defense of the weak. But for the most feared orders in history, honor wore a far crueler face. For them, honor was not about mercy or compassion, but about instilling terror, enforcing obedience, and demonstrating absolute dominance. Behind banners that preached righteousness, these knights wielded torture and brutal methods not only as punishments, but as deliberate tools of fear. Their honor code was written not in mercy, but in pain. The paradox was striking. While their vows spoke of loyalty, courage, and devotion to higher causes, their actions often revealed a brutal truth. Cruelty was the currency of authority. The knights understood that fear was far more effective than diplomacy, that the spectacle of suffering could silence dissent faster than any negotiation. Thus, they cultivated reputations as merciless enforcers, cloaking their brutality in the language of justice. One of their most notorious methods was the public execution of enemies and traitors. These were not simple deaths, but orchestrated displays meant to leave lasting scars on the collective memory of entire regions. Captured foes were often subjected to drawn-out deaths, hanging not until death, but until unconsciousness, only to be revived and hanged again. Or being burned alive in marketplaces where the stench of charred flesh became a warning to all who passed. For the knights, these acts were not cruelty, but demonstrations of order, proof that defiance would always be crushed. Torture was not limited to enemies on the battlefield. Within the ranks of the orders themselves, discipline was enforced through horrific punishments. A knight who broke his vows, revealed secrets, or showed cowardice could face the same torment as their sworn foes. Some accounts describe flogging so severe that flesh was torn from bone, while others tell of branding with hot irons to permanently mark dishonor. In extreme cases, traitors were sealed in coffins or walled into chambers, left to starve in silence as a grim reminder to others of the price of betrayal. But the cruelty extended further, spilling into the lives of civilians caught in the path of these brotherhoods. Villages suspected of harboring enemies or resisting authority were subjected to calculated terror. Homes were set ablaze, crops destroyed, and survivors mutilated, so they could spread the message of what awaited anyone who defied the order. Vital limbs were severed, tongues cut out, eyes gouged, acts of mutilation carried out not for necessity, but to create living warnings that fear was the knight's sharpest blade. One of the most chilling methods employed was psychological torment. Captives were often paraded before their comrades, humiliated, and forced to beg for mercy that would never come. Others were kept in darkness for days or weeks, deprived of food and water, until their minds broke long before their bodies did. These tactics revealed that the knights understood terror was not only physical but mental. By crushing hope, they ensured that resistance died before it could be born. The paradox of cruelty cloaked as honor is best seen in how the knights justified their actions. To them, torture was not barbarism but discipline. They argued that mercy toward enemies was cruelty toward the faithful, that sparing dissenters endangered the community as a whole. This twisted reasoning allowed them to perform acts that, by modern standards, would be considered monstrous, while believing themselves righteous. Their cruelty was not random, it was ritualized, legitimized by oaths, and sanctified by their interpretation of divine justice. Fear was their true weapon, sharper than swords and stronger than fortresses. A battle could be won on the field, but terror ensured submission long after the fighting ended. Villages surrendered before sieges began, armies scattered at the sight of their banners, and rulers bent their knees not because they lacked strength, but because they knew resistance meant annihilation. Honor, in this sense, was no longer about courage or loyalty, but about the ruthless efficiency of cruelty disguised as necessity. These practices were not unique to one order, but common among the most feared brotherhoods of knights. In their secret codes, torture was not seen as a failure of honor, but as its enforcement. Every scream, every execution, every mutilated body was proof that their vows were unbreakable, that their authority was absolute, and that the hand of God, or so they claimed, guided their cruelty. The legacy of these brutal methods still echoes through history. Chroniclers recorded with horror the tales of knights who turned entire regions into wastelands, their names whispered like curses. Survivors told stories of iron discipline and merciless justice, painting portraits of warriors who inspired not admiration but dread. To this day, the image of knights is split, shining champions in legend, and ruthless enforcers in the darker truths of history. But perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in the transformation of honor itself. What began as a code meant to restrain violence became a mask that legitimized it. Honor was no longer the shield of the weak, but the sword of the strong, wielded to justify cruelty. This distortion of ideals turned the knightly orders into monsters wearing halos, executioners draped in sacred vows. Their honor did not save lives, it consumed them. In the end, the cruel face of honor reveals one of the darkest truths of power, that ideals can be twisted into instruments of domination, and that words like justice and loyalty can be weaponized to excuse the worst atrocities. The knights who spread fear through torture and terror were not betraying their oaths, they were fulfilling them in the most nightmarish way possible. And their victims, silenced by pain and erased by fire, left behind a legacy written not in glory but in blood and ash. So the image that remains is not of knights bowing in prayer before battle, but of armored figures standing over broken bodies, their hands steady, their consciences untroubled. They believed themselves honorable, yet their honor was cruelty. As their banners waved over smoldering ruins, the world learned to fear not the sword they carried, but the merciless code they lived by. For the most feared knights in history, power was never confined to the battlefield. Steel and blood forged their reputation, but in the shadowed corridors of castles and cloisters, their true dominance was woven through conspiracies, betrayals, and forbidden alliances. While they wore the mask of holy warriors, beneath that mask lay men entangled in ambition, secrets, and corruption. If their swords terrified nations, their whispered pacts and treacherous dealings shook the very foundations of kingdoms. From their earliest rise, knightly orders claimed loyalty to God, to kings, and to the ideals of honor. But loyalty in such a world was fluid, shaped less by devotion and more by survival and ambition. As their influence grew, these orders became powers unto themselves, wealthy, independent, and often more feared than the monarchs they were supposed to serve. With power came paranoia, and with paranoia came betrayal. Brothers in arms turned against each other, leaders plotted in silence, and alliances were struck, not in open council but in hidden chambers lit by torchlight. One of the most persistent accusations against these knights was their involvement in secret pacts that defied the very values they proclaimed. To the outside world, they fought in the name of God. But behind closed doors, whispers spread of alliances with merchants, nobles, and even enemies they pretended to fight. Some chroniclers suggest that these orders sold protection for gold, striking deals with rulers and warlords who should have been their sworn foes. For the knights, loyalty to their coffers sometimes outweighed loyalty to their vows. Conspiracies also infected their inner hierarchy. The rigid structure of obedience, while seemingly unbreakable, often masked a web of rivalries. Leaders competed for influence, knights jostled for advancement, and disputes were settled not with debate but with assassination cloaked as divine punishment. Betrayal was a constant shadow. A brother one day could become an enemy the next, condemned by whispers of heresy, treason, or impurity of vow. Many knights learned that their greatest danger was not on the battlefield but within their own ranks. Equally disturbing were the rumors of forbidden practices, rituals, and pacts that crossed into the realm of the occult. Whether these accounts were exaggerations by their enemies or glimpses of truth is uncertain. But the persistence of such tales is telling. Chroniclers wrote of secret ceremonies conducted at midnight, of oaths sworn not to God but to shadowy powers that promised wealth and invincibility. Some accused the knights of idolatry, of bowing before symbols and objects whose meaning was hidden from the outside world. These whispers painted them not as defenders of the faith, but as heretics cloaked in steel, their power drawn from unholy alliances. Kings and popes alike came to fear these orders, not only for their swords, but for their independence. They had become too wealthy, too influential, too secretive. Rulers realized that knights who once served as protectors could just as easily become threats. In times of crisis, the accusation of conspiracy became a weapon. Orders were dissolved, leaders arrested, and knights tortured until confessions were extracted. Confessions that spoke of secret meetings, of betrayals against crown and church, and of pacts struck in the shadows. But whether every accusation was true mattered less than the perception it created. The aura of secrecy surrounding the knights made conspiracy believable. Their hidden rituals, their refusal to share knowledge with outsiders, and their immense wealth bred suspicion. People came to believe that no order could hold such power without dark alliances. Even when the truth was blurred by propaganda, the fear was real, and fear was often as destructive as fact. The most infamous examples of betrayal often emerged when knights shifted their allegiance in times of war. In battles where defeat seemed certain, some orders negotiated in secret, promising to spare their enemies in exchange for survival or gold. To their allies, these were acts of treason. To the knights, they were acts of pragmatism, the preservation of the order above all else. This cold calculation revealed that for many, vows were tools, discarded when inconvenient. Honor became flexible, stretched and broken by the weight of ambition. At the heart of these conspiracies lay one truth. The orders had become states within states. With their own laws, wealth, and armies, they operated in ways that rivaled kingdoms. Such autonomy inevitably led to conflict with the powers that had once supported them. Kings who once relied on their strength began to fear their independence. Popes who once blessed their campaigns began to question their loyalty. In the end, the knights' conspiracies and betrayals caught up with them, fueling purges, arrests, and executions. Yet their downfall only deepened the mystery. When orders were suppressed, treasures vanished, archives were destroyed, and leaders died under torture without revealing all their secrets. What survived were fragments, rumors of hidden wealth, pacts made with shadowy forces, and betrayals that shifted the course of history. This silence, whether enforced or chosen, ensured that the legend of conspiracy grew stronger. The less people knew, the more they imagined, and imagination painted the knights as masterminds of shadowy plots far beyond what could ever be proven. The legacy of these conspiracies is chilling. They remind us that power and secrecy are a dangerous combination. Behind every oath of loyalty lurked ambition. Behind every vow of purity hid temptation. The knights, who terrified nations on the battlefield, were equally feared in council chambers, where a whisper could destroy kingdoms as surely as a sword. Their reputations as traitors, heretics, and conspirators lingered long after their banners fell, casting shadows that history has never fully erased. And so, the most feared knights in history reveal their darker side, not just through their cruelty and war, but through the webs of deceit they wove in silence. They were not merely warriors bound by vows. They were power brokers, manipulators, and conspirators. Their betrayals weakened kingdoms, toppled allies, and left behind scars that shaped centuries of distrust. The image that remains is one of steel-clad figures not only charging across battlefields, but gathering in secret chambers, voices lowered, hands clasping in forbidden pacts. They smile at their allies while plotting their downfall. They kneel in prayer by day, and by night they whisper promises to powers unknown. This is the other side of the order, not the defenders of faith, but the architects of conspiracy. For centuries, the most feared knights in history stood as untouchable symbols of power. Their banners struck terror, their rituals forged unbreakable loyalty, and their wealth rivaled kingdoms. But in the end, the same fear and secrecy that made them invincible became the weight that dragged them into ruin. Their legacy was cursed, their glory dismantled, and their names forever marked by suspicion. History, once their servant, became their executioner. The downfall of these knights did not come on battlefields. No army crushed their fortresses through sheer force of arms. Instead, it came through accusations, betrayal, and the turning of kings and popes who had once blessed them. Power breeds paranoia, and when knights became too powerful, they ceased to be tools and became threats. Rulers who once depended on them to wage wars now feared them as rivals. The very kings who had called them brothers sharpened their knives against them. The accusations were devastating: heresy, corruption, treason, and forbidden pacts. Whispers of secret rituals and blasphemous ceremonies, once dismissed as rumor, were weaponized into charges that justified their destruction. Trials were staged not to uncover truth, but to legitimize eradication. Torture chambers echoed with forced confessions as knights, broken on racks or burned with irons, admitted to crimes they may or may not have committed. The spectacle of their humiliation was as important as their punishment. The world needed to see that these once feared warriors could be broken. But whether the charges were true mattered little. The perception of guilt was enough. Their secrecy had always been their greatest strength, but in the eyes of their enemies it became proof of darkness. Hidden rituals became evidence of heresy. Wealth hoarded in treasuries became proof of greed. Oaths of silence became confessions of conspiracy. The same shadows that had shielded them for centuries now damned them in the light of accusation. The end was brutal. Leaders of knightly orders were dragged before inquisitors, mocked in courts, and executed in public squares. Entire orders were dissolved, their properties seized, their fortresses handed over to rival powers. Some knights fled into exile, vanishing into the anonymity of foreign lands. Others resisted, choosing death in battle rather than dishonor. But the tide was unstoppable. Once kings and clergy united against them, no fortress was strong enough, no oath binding enough to protect them. And yet their destruction did not erase them. If anything, it immortalized them. The mystery of their rituals, the secrecy of their archives, and the suddenness of their downfall gave rise to legends that far outlived their swords. People whispered of hidden treasures smuggled away before the purges, of secret archives buried in mountains or catacombs, of surviving knights who swore vengeance and plotted in shadows. The absence of answers made the myths more powerful than truth ever could. Their cursed legacy also left scars on the very societies that destroyed them. Kingdoms that seized their lands found themselves haunted by unrest. Rulers who executed them discovered that their reputations carried the stain of betrayal. The destruction of knightly orders fractured alliances, weakened military power, and left gaps that rival powers rushed to fill. The attempt to erase their influence only proved how deeply they had shaped the medieval world. But perhaps the most enduring curse was the way they became symbols of both fear and fascination. In the centuries that followed, their image shifted in cultural memory. To some, they remained heretics and conspirators, damned by their own corruption. To others, they became martyrs, victims of envy and greed, crushed by kings and popes who could not tolerate their independence. And for many, they became something in between, shadows on the edge of history, half heroes, half monsters, whose secrets still provoke speculation. Stories of their supposed survival persisted. Legends claim that fragments of their brotherhood endured, hidden beneath new guises, weaving their influence in silence. Some believed they carried forbidden knowledge, ancient relics, or maps to treasures that kings could never uncover. These myths gave birth to centuries of speculation, conspiracies, and tales that still echo today. The cursed legacy of the knights is not just their destruction, but the eternal question. What truths were buried with them, and what power might still remain hidden? The irony is striking. The knights who built their reputation on fear ended as victims of it. The very terror they inspired in enemies and rulers eventually turned back upon them. The secrecy that had bound them together and made them invincible became the justification for their downfall. They were hunted not only for what they did, but for what people believed they might have done. In this way, their destruction was inevitable, written into the same shadows that had once protected them. Yet even in ruin, their power lingers. To this day, the image of armored figures bound by oaths and mysteries continues to captivate imagination. They are remembered not as mere soldiers, but as symbols of secrecy, fear, and betrayal. Their cursed legacy is not just that they were hunted by history, but that they refused to die within it. They endure as myths, as warnings, as shadows that remind us how thin the line is between honor and corruption, faith and fanaticism, power and doom. In the end, the story of the most feared knights is not one of triumph, but of caution. It shows how power built on secrecy and fear cannot last, and how the shadows that shield can also strangle. Their downfall reveals a truth that echoes across ages. No order, no matter how feared, can escape the judgment of history. The world will always turn against those who grow too powerful, too secretive, too feared. And when it does, their legacy will be written not by their swords, but by the ruins they leave behind. So the image that remains is haunting. Armored figures once rode through battlefields like gods of war, their enemies scattering before them. Now they stand only in memory, chained in courts, burned in pyres, their banners torn and their names cursed. And yet in the silence left behind, their shadows linger. Perhaps they are gone. Perhaps they endure in secret. But their cursed legacy is certain. The most feared knights in history were not destroyed by their enemies. They were devoured by their own power. Power is often remembered in banners and battles, in the gleam of armor and the clash of swords. Yet the story of the most feared knights in history is not one of simple triumph. It is a tale of shadows, of brotherhoods born in blood, rituals whispered in darkness, faith twisted into fanaticism, cruelty disguised as honor, conspiracies cloaked in secrecy, and a legacy so cursed that even their destruction could not erase them. Their story does not end on the battlefield, but in the whispers of history, where their shadows still linger, haunting the world they once ruled through terror. From the very beginning, these knights were not ordinary warriors. They were crafted through rituals that stripped away individuality, reshaping men into weapons bound by oaths stronger than iron. Their power was not simply in the steel they carried, but in the fear they inspired. Villages surrendered at the sight of their banners. Armies faltered before their charge. Their reputation preceded them like a storm, and they cultivated it deliberately. Through massacres, through rituals, through an honor code that sanctified cruelty. Theirs was a power that thrived not on compassion, but on the certainty of terror. The engine of their dominance was faith transformed into fanaticism. They believed themselves chosen, their violence justified by divine will. Every battle became a holy war, every sword stroke a judgment. They did not see enemies as men, but as heretics, obstacles to be purged in the name of purity. Mercy was weakness. Hesitation was sin. Their fanaticism made them invincible, for they did not fear death. They welcomed it as the price of service. Yet it also made them monstrous, sanctifying atrocities that scarred lands and peoples for centuries. Behind the battlefield, their methods were even darker. Torture was not a failure of discipline, but the very face of honor. They punished traitors with brutality, mutilated survivors to spread warnings, and used psychological torment to break the will of foes before blades were ever drawn. Cruelty was ritualized, legitimized by oaths, and cloaked in divine authority. Honor for them was not compassion. It was the ruthless enforcement of obedience through fear and pain. But the darkness of the knights was not confined to open war.
Yes.
In their fortresses and secret councils, they wove webs of conspiracy and betrayal. Oaths of loyalty masked rivalries, forbidden pacts blurred the line between devotion and corruption. And alliances were struck with enemies in the name of survival or greed. Their secrecy, once their strength, became their doom. Whispers of heresy, occult rituals, and treasonous deals spread, eroding the trust of kings and popes who had once been their allies. In the shadows where they thrived, they also sowed the seeds of their downfall. When history turned against them, it was merciless. Accusations of heresy and corruption unleashed purges that shattered their orders. Torture chambers echoed with forced confessions, fortresses fell, and leaders were burned, hanged, or broken. The same fear that once protected them became the weapon used to destroy them, yet their annihilation did not erase them. It immortalized them. Their secrets, buried under fire and silence, became legends. Their treasures, lost or hidden, became the fuel of centuries of speculation. Their very absence gave birth to myths more powerful than their presence had ever been, and so their legacy is cursed. They are remembered as both monsters and martyrs, heretics and heroes, villains and victims. Their cruelty cannot be denied, but neither can the fear that kings and popes felt toward them. Were they destroyed for their sins, or because they had grown too powerful, too independent, too feared? History offers no simple answer. Instead, it leaves behind fragments, whispers of rituals, stories of forbidden pacts, scars etched on the lands they once dominated. What endures is the warning they embody. The most feared knights in history reveal how easily ideals can be corrupted. Honor becomes cruelty. Faith becomes fanaticism. Brotherhood becomes conspiracy. Power becomes self-destruction.
Your story is not just a medieval tale, but a timeless lesson.
That when secrecy, fear, and ambition fuse together, they create monsters disguised as saints. No matter how powerful those monsters become, history will eventually hunt them down. The image that remains is haunting. Once they rode through fields like gods of war, their armor gleaming, their enemies trembling. Now they are shadows, chained in courts, broken under torture, cursed in chronicles. Their banners are torn, their fortresses in ruins, their names etched in infamy. And yet they endure. In myths of hidden treasures, in stories of secret survivors, in the fascination of generations who cannot look away from their darkness, their legacy is not buried. It is eternal. The most feared knights in history remind us that power built on blood and secrecy cannot last. Fear may win battles, but it cannot escape history's judgment. In the end, their thrones became tombs, their vows became curses, and their brotherhood became legend. Theirs is a story not of glory, but of terror, and of how terror, no matter how absolute, always consumes itself. So the next time you hear the romantic tales of knights in shining armor, remember this. Behind the myth of chivalry lies a truth far darker. The most feared knights were not saviors, but executioners. They were not saints, but zealots. They built empires of fear, and in the end, they were devoured by the very shadows they created. That is their true legacy, not honor, not faith, not victory, but the eternal reminder that the line between protector and monster is thinner than a blade.
History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.